Why we should not build systems for perfection.
How you respond when things go wrong matters. How leaders act and respond count.
I am Nuala Gage.
And I'm Karen Avari. And together we are the Safety Collaborators. And our mission is to help people change the way they think about safety. So this week we continue with the 5 principles of human performance. Number 4 is context influences behaviour, systems drive outcomes. Number 5 is how you respond to failure matters. How leaders act and respond counts. In the last couple of episodes, we talked about the first 3. Feel free to go back and have a listen to those episodes. So last week we spoke about the second principle, blame fixes nothing, and the third principle, learning and improving are vital. So let's continue now with principle 4.
Principle 4 is context influences behaviour and systems drive outcomes. And I think it might be helpful before we even get into this to think about when we talk about systems, what are we talking about? Karen, can you give us a bit of context around that?
So when we think about systems, everything that we do, every aspect of our life is driven by some sort of system, whether it's nature or engineered by humans. But let's go to something that we all do regularly, and let's go to the supermarket or the grocery store, an airport. These are all places that are absolutely designed and driven, and they drive our behaviour. They are systems driven. They are designed to make us do things in different ways. So if you think about a supermarket, you might be going in for a litre of milk or a pint of milk, whichever language you're speaking in. And where do they put these milk? Down towards the back of the supermarket. Why? Because they're driving you on a journey to get there so that you might see other things that you didn't actually even come in for. I don't know about you, whenever I walk into a homeware store, I always end up buying stuff I didn't know I even needed. I quite enjoy that, to be honest, but it's not always good. But the point here is that these systems are designed to drive our behaviours. And if we think about our systems in the workplace, how many systems have we put in place that drive the way people do things? So whether it's safety rules, whether it's how we communicate, all of these are driven by different systems. So a lot of safety culture actually is about systems thinking. In the book, The 5 Principles of Human Performance by Todd Conklin, where these 5 principles come from, he has a quote here that says, "Bad outcomes are from weak and brittle systems, not weak and brittle people." That statement could sting a little. Some people will, hang on a minute, what do you mean? We're not brittle, that's not brittle. But the reality is, especially if we've created something great, or we think that we have, it can be hard to get the feedback that we need, or that maybe the system isn't so great. And that is a perfect opportunity for continuous improvement if we can let go of our ego and if we become open to feedback. So part of the systems driving the outcome is also how do we build in the feedback mechanism that's often missing. So just because something worked like some way in the past doesn't mean it's always has to be done that way moving forward. How hard is it to get feedback that the system or process you designed is not helpful or useful or going to solve the problem that we think it's going to solve? Nules, we were talking a little bit earlier. You shared a story. Why don't you go down that path?
So I was recently working with a client and we needed to design, it was more of a process, I suppose, but it linked into the overall system. The request that was given to me was quite interesting because it did speak well to the system and how things are done, in the way of work. And there was a new process that needed to be developed, and the request was, "You've been involved, you've been observing this as a safety coach. Please, could you help us put together a process? Because it's just everybody's doing their own thing, things aren't flowing well, and there's also quite a large safety risk here." So I thought, okay, from my observations that I'd had over the previous few days, I wrote together step by step, this is what happens in this particular operation that needs to be done. And I asked a few people for feedback. And eventually I actually printed it out and put it on some key people's desks. And I said, please give feedback on this because it's not for me. I don't have to be involved in this at all. But It's your team, your people that need to make this happen. And a couple of people gave a bit of vague feedback, like, yeah, it's okay, maybe include this, or can we tweak the wording here? That's fine. So I was like, oh, okay, not really the feedback I was hoping for. I wanted something a little bit more robust. And I left it on one of the desks of somebody quite senior who was working at night. And the next morning I walked in there and he had already finished shift. And the guys that were working with him had these wide eyes when I said, well, where's the feedback? And they were like, we don't want to give it to you. So I said, why not? They were like, no. I said, just give me the feedback. And across this process that I step-by-step guide I'd put in place was this big failed. And big
in red pen.
Yes, bold,
Yeah.
failed.
Yeah.
And I was like, fabulous, but is there any more feedback other than just failed? And there were a couple of notes, and then at the bottom it just said, come and see me tonight, please, because this is too much to try and put in a note. And I was like, awesome feedback. And the guys were like, what do you mean? That's awesome feedback. I said, look, he could have given me the feedback slightly differently, but what he's saying is that if we try and implement this, it's going to fail. It's not going to work. It's not going to be helpful. And then we ended up reworking the entire thing, separating it out in different ways. And it made so much sense. One, because he was part of the system. He worked with the people and he was very candid in giving feedback. And yes, people may not always respond well to that kind of candid response. But overall, it became something far more useful than something that would have gone, this isn't helpful, file 13, we're going to carry on doing things the way that we were doing them, hope everything works out and nobody gets hurt. So we often try and build systems for perfection because I've been observing this whole process and what needed to happen between shore, between offshore, between the different departments, between head office, and it's dynamic. And I think that was one of the conversations we had with everyone, was that this is something that's dynamic because it is going to change. We can't build it to be perfect, but we need to build it in a sense that there is room for maneuverability and be able to continuously receive feedback that maybe this needs to change, or maybe that isn't working, or maybe even, we've actually built in some unwritten rules into this that are not actually in the process. So how do we update and adapt?
I think what's interesting listening to that story is a couple of things stood out for me. One is this thing about feedback, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also have to learn how to give feedback, I think. That's part of the process, if you like, of improvement. And what we recognised in that story is it might not be perfect feedback, but it was useful feedback. And often if we think, I don't want to upset this person, or I don't want to say this, or I don't want to do that, it becomes not useful feedback.
On that one, what you're saying there makes me think of the principle around learning is vital and important, and learning is deliberate.
Absolutely.
They all link, all these principles link to each other, and you can't have the one without the other. And if we're not looking at our system and going, what can we learn from this? What is useful? What isn't useful? And how do we improve it? And deliberately go out there and make it better. We're just going to carry on doing the same thing in the same way, expecting a different result.
Yeah. For you who's listening, you might think, well, hang on, what's this got to do with systems? If we're building systems but aren't giving the right feedback on how to improve on that system. So I know that in our conversation earlier, that this procedure that you built in the end had to be redesigned so that individuals that were looking at it could get the information more easily. Whereas the initial way of putting it together was like just a long story, was one thing after another. This is the process. But not every element of that process applied to every single person that was part of the procedure that you were building. So really interesting stuff. We thought we'd have a little bit of fun with this one because in case you don't know what ChatGPT is, it is an AI-based platform that helps us maybe to answer some of these questions. So we thought we'd have a little bit of fun with this and asked it to come up with a summary for this particular principle. So if we think about context influences behaviour, systems drive outcome, here is what are some key elements to that. So first we need to understand the context, consider the various elements or people of that context. And that includes social norms, cultural values, past experience, etc. Systematic thinking. So systems drive the outcomes through patterns of behaviour and decision making. So how easy do we make it for people to make the right choices, to make the right decisions? So think about your safety policies and procedures. Recognising power dynamics. I found this one really interesting. So these systems are often designed and maintained by those in positions of power. And if you think about that, who designs them? It's not the person that's actually doing the work. It's somewhere else. It's being done somewhere else. So think about that as well. How can you bring other people into the conversation? Are there any inequalities or biases that are being built into the system that maybe shouldn't be there? Incentives. We often talk about, what behaviours are we rewarding or punishing? So what incentives are we also putting out there? So that can also influence the way people behave. And reflection. So how well are we reflecting on and identifying what's working, what isn't? And I think that ties into what you were saying about the feedback. Giving you good feedback ended up producing a much better system process for, what was it again? It was how people were getting onto
a taxi boat.
Yeah, on the taxi boat. So from the rig or from land to getting in between the rig and shore. Yeah. So the procedure for getting people on and off the rig, that's right. I was trying to think it was helicopter, but I thought, I don't think we'd be involved with helicopters. But
no.
No. So that kind of summarises principle 4. So let's move into principle 5. Over to you.
Right, before we move into principle 5, and I'm going to just share another example of systems which may or may not be helpful. We do a lot of travel. And one of the big bugbears that a lot of airlines get complaints on is how long it takes from when they get off the plane to receiving their baggage.
Oh, my word. Yep.
And there was a huge amount of work and research and consultants being brought in to say, how can you improve the time from getting the bag off the plane to it being in the person's hand? And one of the biggest around systems drive behaviors is in the new airports, what they changed, and think about this when you're going through an airport, is they changed the distance that the passenger has to take in order to get to their bag, because they had got the time to its minimum. They could not reduce the time anymore. But what they could do was increase the time that it takes for a passenger to get to their bag.
Yep.
So you have to now go maybe through some random passages, and you're thinking, why am I walking so far just to go and get my bag? It's not that far away. I'm having to walk past shops in big international airports. It's past duty-free, past coffee stations, past bathrooms. So you can take a loo break. You can grab a cup of coffee. You can sort your kids out, go and change a nappy if you need to change a nappy. So that by the time you arrive, you are no longer frustrated, irritated, or angry because you've had to wait 25 to 40 minutes for your bag to come out. But your bag is miraculously there when you finally walk into the carousel area. And yet they have taken you on a journey so that you leave the airport in a better behavior with a better outcome than frustration of having to sit there and wait. And I've had that experience recently landing in, I think it was Heathrow actually, where you come off the flight straight to the carousel and now you wait. And you wait.
And wait.
And you wait.
Yep.
And your irritation and frustration and your behavior completely changes by the time you've walked out of the airport. So just as we were chatting, I just thought, now there's an example of how a system completely changes a behavior and an outcome.
Absolutely. And you just reminded me of another really great example, and that's elevators and elevator music. Right. So when elevators were first designed, they take as long as they take to get through a certain number of floors. People were frustrated and they thought, well, we can't really speed up the elevator because that would cause a whole range of other issues. So what can we do to help reduce the frustration of the people in the elevator? And that is how they introduced elevator music. I don't know about you, but personally I find elevator music horrible. But however, we're talking about a long time ago. That's actually how they help people to not feel time. So by having that distraction by the music, it made them feel like they weren't taking as long to get from one floor to the next. And that's actually how elevator music was born.
That's brilliant.
Because they decided that's how we can distract people.
Yep.
They never changed the speed of elevators. Not then anyway. I'm sure they have now, but,
Yes.
yeah, in the early days. So it's fascinating stuff, how systems impact how we do things.
Absolutely. And how we try and redesign them to take into the fact that people are inconsistent and help them navigate that. So interesting.
Absolutely.
And when we think about those examples, it's kind of like it does lead us into principle 5. How we respond matters, and how leaders respond to failure does count. And even being able to ask for feedback, like, hey, give me feedback on this system or process, can be really difficult. But how much more difficult can it be to speak up when we make a mistake? And one of our regular questions is, do you feel safe to speak up? So today, let's think about what emotions come into play when you make a mistake, or when you find or you catch someone else making a mistake, or that they had made a mistake and it's now coming out. What emotions come into play?
I know how I feel when I've made a mistake. I might feel angry at myself, or I might feel angry at the system, or I might feel shame because, well, how many times we've got, oh, idiot, you didn't mean to do it that way, or, oh my God, I can't believe I did it like that, etc., etc. Or we feel guilt, because maybe we've done something that's impacted somebody else or something else, and if we don't mention it, the problem is when we feel any of those emotions, anger, shame, or guilt, we start to shut down, we start to protect ourselves. Our chemicals start playing in our system. Cortisol rises, which means that we start to get anxious as well. When we're angry about something, then we might think, okay, that was a mistake, or somebody shouldn't have done that, or I'm going to go out there and solve that, because anger is telling us that there's been some sort of injustice done to me or to something that I care about. Shame is a little more internal, but is also more around the community. So if I feel shame because I've upset the community or the expectation, and then guilt sits within us as like, hey, I'm blaming myself for something. So these are 3 very common emotions that may stop someone from speaking up. So they may not share what's really happened because they're working through these emotions. And how does that sit with you as a leader?
I was going to say, and how does that then kind of like you take the next step? So you're sitting with this and you're going, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this anger, shame, guilt, whatever it is. Can I fix it before anybody finds out?
Oh, there's that as well, right? So what are we hiding?
Can I sweep it under the carpet, or do we have to deal with this? Then it links back into that, well, do we go into blame? Do we blame ourselves? Do we blame somebody else? And as an individual, as a team member, I've heard people say, oh, did you hear what so-and-so did? And then they try to cover it up. And I'm like, that's interesting. Because I would have had a conversation more than likely with the person who supposedly was trying to cover this up. And what they were doing was going, how do I correct this so that there isn't a further negative implication that is going to impact people, process, and environment? And then I need to ask for help. So there's so many things, there's so many assumptions I feel that can play into how we individually respond, how those around us respond, and how our leaders respond. Do they respond with are you stupid? Well, how could you do this? Do they respond with okay, everybody, let's take a deep breath. What do we need to do? You do this, you do that, you do this, we'll report that, whatever needs to happen. And I think as leaders, we've got to remember that there is always someone watching.
Absolutely. How you move, how you speak, how you roll your eyes, there is always someone watching that and will be impacted by that.
And it doesn't mean you get it right all the time.
Absolutely not.
I can assure you, even at home, I don't respond the way that I would hope that I would respond in most situations. But it's about how do you bounce back from that, and how do you then go and say, okay, I was a little bit taken aback there. My emotions took over. Let's have a different conversation now. And it can be hard. I don't know about you, but I think it can be quite a lonely journey being in that position.
Absolutely it is. And I think it's really important for leaders to get support, whether it's someone they can talk to. It can be a family member, it can be a friend, it can be a coach, it can be a professional coach, it can be whatever the case may be. And I mean, we obviously do a lot of that with people. to help them navigate some of those. In terms of the fifth principle, it's really is you as a leader have an incredible impact on what happens next, and you may not even realize it. And that's the thing to be conscious of. And when we want people to respond, when we want people to speak up, to feel safe to speak up, you as a leader, you've got to balance permission and respect both ways. And when we do that, this is actually the foundations of psychological safety, in fact. So the more permission and respect that we give the team or the people that we're working with, the safer we make it for people to speak up, to share, even if they are feeling anger or shame or guilt or blamed. If the environment's safe enough for them to speak up, then you as a leader, what you do next counts. It matters a lot.
For me, it brings it back to that vulnerability, because
absolutely,
this is a stage where everyone is vulnerable in one way or another, is when things go wrong.
Yeah.
And
everybody.
For me, that it's these kind of reactions that will be foundational to your culture, be foundational to the way people move forward. Be foundational to so many aspects of trust, of respect, of permission, as you said.
It's important, if we summarize this a little bit about, how leaders respond and why it's important. The leader's response sets the tone, as you said, for the organization, for the safety culture, because given that's kind of what we talk about a lot. And it impacts how people feel, their morale, those types of things. It also is important because it means as a leader, you are taking responsibility and you will model accountability. So if you show up and even if you say, oh my God, I've messed up here, then you're modeling the way for others to do the same. That's part of that permission process. That vulnerability that you just mentioned reveals your emotional intelligence levels, if you like. So how emotionally intelligent are we? And we need to learn this. Unfortunately, we don't really learn it at school so much. So it's something that we can learn and get better at, is understanding our own emotional intelligence. The more transparent you are, the more trust you will build as a leader. And again, if you want to encourage people to speak up, to share, to come up even with ideas, then that is an important component. And failure, it's not my favorite word anymore. I prefer falling, but that's okay. Failure provides opportunities for growth. So if we have failed or if we have fallen, how do we help each other to get back up and to improve and have a growth mindset? That is what fosters what we want, is a learning culture or a culture of learning. This is also one of the principles, is how do we create that environment of learning?
For me, it makes you think that you can blame and punish, or you can learn and improve when something happens in your organization. But you cannot do both.
Very hard, very hard. Because they both require a very different mindset.
And we might get it wrong ourselves, where we're trying to learn and improve and we end up blaming and punishing. So bring back that transparency and vulnerability and go, oops, I messed up.
That's going to wrap us up for the 5 principles. So just to remind you what those 5 principles again are: error is normal. Even the brightest of us will make a mistake. Blame fixes nothing. Learning and improving is vital. Therefore, make learning deliberate. Context influences behaviour. Our systems drive outcomes. So think about your systems. What have you put in place? And how you respond matters. How leaders act and respond counts. So feel free to email us if we can help you a little bit more at hello@safetycollaborations.com.
And thank you for joining us today. It's always lovely to have conversations that matter. We'd love to hear your thoughts and hashtag conversations that matter so that we can see what you have to say. Till next week, stay safe and stay well.